This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey everyone, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary on a serial killer. And for this, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I kind of wanted to change a pace because my last few reviews was all three Conversations with the Killer series on Netflix, Night Stalker on Netflix, Ted Bundy Falling for a Killer, and each one, those are all 3 to 5 hour long episodes. So I kind of just wanted to do something, quicker, change of pace, maybe something a little bit more low key. And those are like really well done docuseries. I kind of wanted to go back to similar to the Eileen Wuornos documentary and interviews that I reviewed. Just something a bit more bare bones, intimate, raw, sort of one and done. And this is one that used to be on Netflix. That was the first time I saw it. I've seen it 2 or 3 times before, because it's only 44 minutes. It's pretty short. So this was probably the 3rd or 4th time I've seen it. And it came out in 2008, or it was made, came out in 2008. Has a pretty generic title. Interview with the Serial Killer. Yeah, that's it. Just Interview with the Serial Killer. But it's a 2008 interview with, I would say he's a pretty notorious serial killer, the Genesee River Killer, Arthur Shawcross. Now, I've always thought of Shawcross and Genesee River Killer to be one of the most notorious American serial killers that's maybe not quite a household name. Like you have Bundy, Gacy, Dahmer, Manson up here. Then I would say you have people like BTK, Dennis Rader, Zodiac, Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, Robert Hansen, Wayne Williams, Atlanta child murderer, and Genesee River Killer, Arthur Shawcross. I actually didn't really know anything about Shawcross before I saw this for the very first time, probably 5 or 6 years ago. The only thing I knew of him was there's a song by Cannibal Corpse. I think it's Addicted to Vaginal Skin off of Tomb of the Mutilated. If it's not that one, it is off Tomb of the Mutilated, where it has a quote by Arthur Shawcross as the intro. That was all I knew about Arthur before seeing this for the first time. And it is a really bare bones sort of documentary. You have this jailhouse interview with the director, the narrator, Christopher Martin, who I believe this was his only directorial effort, or his only filmmaking effort. Based on what I've seen, that's what I saw. But we sort of cut away from time to time, and it tells briefly a brief story of Arthur Shawcross. Now, you get the interviews. It'll cut to some interviewees like the captain of the police in Rochester, someone who worked police in Watertown, both in New York, FBI profiler, assistant DA for the trial. People involved with his case we get interviews from, but you also get news footage, archive footage of the recovery of the bodies, the arrest, the trial, the sentencing, some of the psychiatric evaluations he had. It has footage of all that. It goes very, very, very little into the history of Arthur Shawcross. It barely mentions his childhood, barely mentions his time in Vietnam. Really, the only thing it mentions is the really extravagant, wild stories he would tell about Vietnam or his childhood. And then we get interviews with people who are debunking everything that he says. So we could probably rule out everything he said about Vietnam. The stuff about his childhood, he did have a turbulent childhood, but it wasn't quite to the level of the sexual abuse by his mother that he says. Or at least it was never proven. though the psychiatrists and people like that involved in his defense do believe it to be true. It's never been proven. It's been more disproven than proven. But I would probably say this is a good beginner sort of documentary. It's structured very much like your typical kind of true crime program, where each episode is a different killer. You know, Born to Kill, World's Most Evil, A&E documentaries, where it starts out with the area going into the last few victims, how police don't know who it is, but then there's evidence that lead them to this person. They arrest, insert name. They start looking into that person, and then it goes back in time and works through their entire story. It's kind of structured like that. It's structured more like that than, say, some other documentary. I would say that this is more deserving of the title Interview with a Serial Killer than the actual Conversations with the Serial Killer series on Netflix. And that's only because, you know, there is quite a bit of Arthur in this. I mean, of its 44 minutes, I would say at least 15 minutes has to be Arthur himself on screen talking. You do get to hear the director and interviewer, Christopher Martin, deliver the questions, which I always liked. I do like it when you get to hear the interviewer ask the questions, because I think it makes it more intimate. It does make the answers seem more off the cuff, as opposed to just cutting back to the killer and sort of him saying something out of context to the audience in relation to the questions that can be edited in any such a way. So I always found it more intimate, telling, and interesting when you do get to hear the interviewer ask the questions and their response to it. And what I have to say about Shawcross is it gets into all his murders. Now, it doesn't talk about each victim individually. Of course, he killed 12 women in the Rochester area between March of '89 and March of '88, December of '89. He was tried for 11 of them. The 12th one they couldn't quite link to him, but you know, we do know that he did it. It only mentions a few of them, but it does mention his 2 murders in Watertown in 1972, where he murdered 2 children, where he sexually assaulted, mutilated, and killed 2 children, 8-year-old Karen Hill, 10-year-old Jack Blake. And it goes into the plea deal and how he served just under 15 years, got paroled. It does mention the psychiatrist's sort of warnings that he's not ready and him being let out, only to kill 12 more women. And in the interviews, along with the A&E episode that was on him, which I've seen bits of, I know there's a DVD of it, I would love to get it. I know in both of those, he refuses to talk about Watertown. And with the people that are interviewed on the psychiatrist side of it, it does go into his justifications, like why he doesn't talk about Watertown, but why he talks about the prostitutes in Rochester. We actually, when he's being interviewed, we get some of his justifications. And if people think Jeffrey Dahmer was very forthcoming, open, and kind of nonchalant, or if BTK was very dry, you know, very matter-of-factly, Arthur Shawcross is... He has a lot of what the fuck in his voice, almost to the point of bragging. Like, bragging in like a no-duh kind of way. I mean, there's a line that I kind of can't help but kind of be like, Jesus, every time I hear it. When the interviewer mentions, you know, because Shawcross would murder a prostitute, leave, he'd come back, he'd mutilate the corpse, have sex with the corpse, and in the case of 3 of them, cut out and eat their genitals. And on one, I believe it was June Cicero. It was either June Cicero or the one just prior to her, where the interviewer asks how the head had been removed in a completely different spot. And Shawcross is like, yeah. Interviewer asks, uh, how did that happen? And Shawcross is just like, how? Easy. You just pick it up and you move it. And it's just so blunt, and he's talking about doing these things to people in such a no shit, like no duh kind of matter of fact way that I think is even beyond the nonchalant nature of Dahmer or BTK or other people that are just very open about the things they've done. I've always found this case fascinating, and it doesn't go into a lot, it's like his childhood, his time in Vietnam, other than just to debunk some of the claims that he made about that time. Really doesn't get into his 5 wives, his 5 marriages, or, because he had justifications for a lot of these murders. Most of them involved they tried to steal his wallet, so he killed them. Really, it just goes into sort of his final answer, the whole AIDS theory that he had, the AIDS story that he gave, which I'll get into when I go over the list of things that it covers. And it pretty much just ends with this long lost daughter that he didn't know he had, which was from an affair in Hawaii during his time in the military. How she reached out to him in 2001, and how they started up a father-daughter relationship along with all 7 of her kids. Now, I've read reviews or people say that's wrong, where people are saying how she's an idiot. I'm guessing there's a lot of psychological baggage with, not having your biological parent and then figuring out who they are and at least wanting to reach out to them. And, she even says that the younger kids don't know what he did, the older ones do. And it's not really her fault if the kids do know what he did, because, I mean, it was 2008, or 2000s, the internet was the internet. They could have just looked it up. It does look like her oldest is in her late teens anyway. And then I've read a ton of theories about Arthur's blinking. He does do some crazy blinking, especially when he's not speaking. A lot of And I even read something where someone said it's the trauma from killing all those people. You don't really get trauma from killing 12 prostitutes when you enjoy killing. That disregards it. It could have been trauma from, that could be a sign that some of the trauma from Vietnam or his childhood is valid to some extent, but nowhere near to the stuff he said. In all honesty, I think it's just a tick. I've seen plenty of elderly people that do crazy things with their eyes or their mouth, and I honestly just think it's a tick. But this came out in 2008, which was the same year that Arthur Shawcross would pass away. He died at the age of 63. And I haven't seen the whole thing of A&E, but I would like to see that. I do have a bunch of stuff on Shawcross. I mean, I meant to say earlier, I would say he's among the biggest, most notorious, or most important serial killers of the 1980s. So he's in this book. 80s and New York, I would say. I do have this book, which I do know that if you bought this new, it would come with a cassette tape that has his confession on it. I bought it used and beat up, so I don't have the cassette tape. But I've seen the tape online where you can buy it by itself. But then also this big book, The Misbegotten Son by Jack Olson, which I think this would be the most definitive one. I've heard some things about Jack Olson, how he writes, but I guess we'll have to see. But yeah, I would say this is a good beginner documentary if you want to get into someone like Shawcross, or if you want just a bare bones, easy to follow, not a lot of information thrown out type of documentary. It goes by quick. It's only 45 minutes. It's definitely a stepping stone. This could definitely get you interested in his story or his case, but it definitely doesn't go. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot about his childhood, all his marriages, each one of the murders that it does leave out. If you want a really good breakdown of his story, the podcast True Crime All the Time, which is one of a few that I listen to, I think that's one of the better breakdowns of his story. But if you want to see a good, quick documentary that's raw, intimate, and not flashy like the Netflix series, it's very low key, indie, low budget, but still well done. Definitely check this out. It's definitely worth it. I mean, it's on YouTube. It's less than an hour, so uh, I've always enjoyed it. It's always something I can put on. If you have already read stuff about Shawcross or listened to podcasts, this really isn't going to offer you any kind of information that's new, other than maybe just the idea of him speaking and coming from him himself. And I do think it ends the most Arthur Shawcross way, because he refuses to talk about Watertown several times. At the very end, the guy brings it up again. He's like, nope, done, this is over. Takes off his microphone, gets up to leave. And the guy says, well, Arthur, I want to thank you for doing this. And just, in the background, you just hear him say, like, fuck off. So, I did think that was funny. So, yeah, if you've already read up on Shawcross, or really read or listened to anything on him and to any extent, this might not offer very much, other than the fact that he himself is speaking. But if not, it's definitely worth it for someone that doesn't know anything about him. And then maybe it will lead you to check out other works on him, because it is a very fascinating story. It is very, he is, I would say, one of the most notorious and important American serial killers. Certainly in the top 20 most notorious. So I've always enjoyed this special documentary, whatever you want to call it. So with that, I guess we'll get into the short summary and then the list of things that it covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film or documentary is based on. Arthur Shawcross, aka the Monster of the Rivers and most notoriously the Genesee River Killer, was convicted of 11 of the 12 murders he committed against women in the Rochester, New York area, mostly prostitutes, between March 1988 and December 1989. Murders that also included rape, mutilation, and in 3 of the victims, cannibalism of their genitals. Prior to that, Shawcross served just under 15 years for the 1972 murders of 10-year-old Jack Blake and 8-year-old Karen Hill in Watertown, New York. A plea bargain earned him a lesser manslaughter charge, despite public outrage, and was released in 1987, despite psychiatrists' warnings of him being a schizoid psychopath. Arthur Shawcross was married 5 times, the last of which staying with him during his incarceration. Shawcross was known for his extravagant and inflated stories, including his time in Vietnam, where he went on secret missions and would cannibalize in order to get information, when in reality he was only a supply clerk, and of his childhood, which was, although turbulent, the sexual abuse by his mother has never been proven. It was believed by the psychiatrists in his defense, but profilers deemed it to be untrue. In 2001, he learned of a long-lost daughter from an affair in Hawaii during his time in the military. His daughter and grandkids became regular visitors until his death in 2008 at the age of 63. Though he has always been open about his murders and told wild stories about his past, he would never discuss his crimes in Watertown, as seen in numerous interviews and documentaries. And so now we get into everything that the film covers. It opens up at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, which is where Arthur Shawcross is being held. Mentions that he murdered 11 women, serving 250 years. He was given 250 years. He was convicted of 11, but he killed 12. And of course, the 2 children of Watertown was a previous series of murders that he technically already served, even though it should have been a life sentence. But yeah, the 12th could never officially be connected to him or be tried. It asks the question, what causes extreme violence and the nature of evil itself? And we get Arthur saying things like, people on the outside don't know what evil is. Like, do you know what evil is? Sure. Are you evil? Somewhat. That's how he answers a lot of questions. Even like, did you do this to her? Or, something like that. There's a lot of like, yeah, probably. Somewhat. Could have. He's very open, but he gives a lot of vague answers like that as well. So then we go to Rochester, New York. Mentions the rough part of Lyell Avenue, which is sort of the red light district of that area. And how in March of '88, women began going missing. It mentions the first 2 women, Dorothy Blackburn and Anne Marie Steffen. It gives their age of occupation, usually just says prostitute. With Steffen, it also says drug addict. And then when and where they were taken from and where they were found and how they were killed. Shows photos of them. We get footage of Lyell Avenue at that time. You get Arthur on how he met Anne Marie Steffen, how he killed her. And even then, how did you kill her? And he says, like, probably strangulation. And how do you know when they're dead? He's like, how? I don't know. Just do. Mostly when they stop moving. So yeah, he is quite candid. And then talks about like, actually, I think he mentions the pressure point later, but he talks about how strangulation usually takes 4 minutes, probably, sometimes less. It goes over the normal part of his life. It mentions his apartment, 4th wife Rose, working at the cheese factory, how he enjoyed going fishing on his off time. Mentions his girlfriend Clara, and how he would also visit Lyell Avenue to seek out prostitutes. Mentions how he didn't kill for almost a year, and then Dorothy Keeler, who was a 59-year-old homeless woman, was found in July of '89. It says she was found July '89. She was actually murdered in July, on July 29th of '89. She was found October 21st. We're introduced to Rochester Police Captain Lynd Johnson, who goes into her discovery. Shawcross on how she lived with him. He would pay her to clean the apartment. Then he found out she was stealing from him, and the narrator asks, like, so did that warrant killing her? And he's like, well, to me it did. That Lynd Johnson on how the killer returned to the jump site and then threw her head in the Genesee River. And then Arthur on that and how he moved her head. That's the part where the interviewer asks, it says that her head had been removed. Yeah. How did that happen? How? Easy. Just pick it up and you move it. It mentions when Patricia Ives was found October 27th of '89 with archive footage. Then it goes into June Stott, who was his 5th murder. And it goes into how she wasn't a prostitute. She was mentally challenged. And how the killer returned and completely eviscerated her. Then we get Arthur on that day that he spent with June Stott, how and why he killed her. And again, just how sort of just nonchalant, candid, and just kind of no duh how he is. Saying like, oh, we went down to some area, spent the day down there, feeding the ducks. And then we started making out. She started freaking out, yelling, "I'm gonna scream!" And I snapped her neck. So he goes into her. Johnson on how the crimes, they now connect the crimes, but they also notice the escalation in the mutilation. How FBI gets involved. We're introduced to Greg McCrary, who is a profiler, and how they come to the conclusion that the killer is a regular John. Uh, there's a few other people they interview, but say like how, you know, the prostitutes have to know that they're all dropping like flies. That it's got to be a client that's doing it. Yet this guy is a regular who they trust, and he's able to blend in, which is true. And then it goes into how police were posing as pimps and the kind of people you'd see in that area. But then Arthur goes into how they would fill him in on details of the case, excuse me, because they thought he was a nobody. He would go to bars, or it even mentions a Dunkin' Donuts. He would befriend all these people. They'd fill him in with, kind of like in the case of Ed Kemper. They were filling the killer in on all these details without realizing it. Although one guy does say it wasn't total intimate details, but Shawcross kind of knew about like stakeouts or stings going on, so he knew how to avoid them. The disappearance of a notorious prostitute, June Cicero, on December 17th, 89, his 11th victim. It goes into who she was, how she was a feared prostitute, a respected prostitute. But it goes into how she was picked up, and then Arthur on how he strangled her, how he dumped her body. Even saying, like, just driving down the road, you open up the door, you kick her out. Then Captain John McCaffrey, who's one of the guys that's already been talking for a little bit, who's part of New York State Police. They were doing a search in a helicopter, and we get footage of the helicopter and the footage of what they caught. They could see a body frozen in ice underneath this bridge, and just nearby they saw this blue, I think it was a Chevrolet, pulled over to the side just near where June Cicero was. Looked like the driver was urinating, and they decided to follow him. And then we go back to Arthur saying how how they saw the car, the guy got back in through the passenger side and then fled. And then Arthur on how he forgot she was there and didn't know why the helicopter was up there. He was just driving normally. But then McCaffrey goes into their theory that he returned to make sure that the body was completely hidden. Then we get footage of the recovery of her body and how they arrested Shawcross and ran his name. Which now we go briefly into his history. Which, you know, how he grew up in Watertown. He was actually born in Kittery, Maine, which maybe 2 hours from where I live. Growing up in Watertown, New York, it mentions how in May 72, the disappearance and search of 8-year-old Karen Hill. We're introduced to Augustine Capone, who was on the Watertown police. Really going into detail of how she was found and finding her body. There was some news anchor whose name I didn't get that goes into it as well, and it goes into detail about her body being pretty much frozen, being buried under a bunch of boulders and rocks, her mouth full of dirt. Then how police were led to 27-year-old Shawcross, who was living with his third wife, Penny, his arrest, photos and actual footage of his arrest, of him at that time. And then Paul Deerdorf, his defense attorney, goes into who Shawcross was as a person at that time. How he was very quick to anger and violence, and how he actually feared Shawcross. But then it goes into the disappearance of 10-year-old Jack Blake, which was 4 months prior. And it goes into Shawcross's connection to him. He would often take the boy fishing. And there's a lot that goes into this story. I mean, there was a whole... It really just goes into... He would go fishing with him, so that's how they knew he did it. There's actually a lot more. I mean, I think he even tried to do stuff with Jack one day, and he didn't like it. But Jack was going to go fishing with him one day. His mother said no. Arthur said, go listen to your mother. But then, Shawcross saw him fishing. There's a whole lot more to that story. But it pretty much just says here that they were able to link him to Jack Blake. And goes into the plea deal that if he confesses to Jack Blake and takes them to where his body is, he'll get a lesser manslaughter charge for Karen Hill. We get photos of police being led to the body. It goes into the public outrage over the plea deal. Then his release in '87, Judge Charles Sigurusa, I think is how you pronounce it, who at the time was the assistant DA of Rochester at that time, goes into how if he had gotten life, he never would have become the Genesee River Killer. It goes into his confession of the Genesee River killings, Arthur on why he confessed. Go back to his interview, where he pretty much just says they got to him. He got tired of 12, 13, 14 hours of interrogation, and that was why he confessed. The footage of his trial, then it goes into the whole idea of his insanity. So we're introduced to Dr. Jonathan Pincus, who's a senior neurologist, and Dr. Dorothy Lewis on their findings in Shawcross. It even has footage of the hypnosis that she put him under, where he relives the sexual abuse that he claimed to have had inflicted on him at the hands of his mother. Arthur on what his mother did to him and how he ran away. The doctors go more into head trauma, abuse, and how that played a role in his murders. Then the previous guy, Sigurusa, on how his mother denied all sexual abuse, which we do get Arthur in the interview discussing his mother's denial, and how other people were denying it, and how the doctors still believe that he endured trauma and sexual abuse, but the DA and the prosecutor couldn't really disprove it, I guess. Then it goes over his time in Vietnam, Arthur telling his extravagant stories involving killing this woman, filleting her flesh, cooking it over a fire, and eating it in front of this other woman to get information from her, and how he was commended by the colonel for doing so. But then the DA, Sigurusa, and the profiler, McCrary, go into how none of that's true. Sigurusa actually goes into how he looked up the commanding officer, who was a guy named Weaver, and he said, no, Shawcross is a supply clerk. He never went on any of these secret missions and did any of that. The footage of the verdict being read and his sentencing, Arthur on his attention and getting all kinds of letters, which he talks, do you feel like you're a kind of celebrity in this prison? He's like, yeah, somewhat. Do you enjoy that? Yeah, sometimes it's a hassle. But how he gets letters from all kinds of people. His justification, he kind of sums it all up that because for a while he said all these different ones tried stealing his wallet, so that's why he killed him. But here, and kind of what he would go with later, was that He was told early on that he had contracted AIDS from a prostitute. He wasn't sure which one it was, so he just started picking up all of them in order to kill them, and then he started eating the vaginas that he cut out, thinking it would speed the process of AIDS and kill him faster. That's his justification. Again, he refuses to talk about Watertown because he had already done that once. McCrary on how he can't justify Watertown. That's why he won't talk about it. Like stealing my wallet, they gave me AIDS. So it makes sense to me why I killed them, but he can't justify the 2 kids in Watertown. So it goes into that a bit. And then we're introduced to Maggie Deming, who's Arthur's long-lost daughter from his time in the military. He was in Vietnam. He had a fling with this one woman, and she was born. And she goes into how and why she reached out to him in 2001. It shows photos of them together, of visiting him at Sullivan. And then it goes into their relationship with him and his relationship with her kids. And then Arthur himself goes into that, how his grandkids send him report cards and whatnot. And then it pretty much just ends with Arthur on how he has no remorse. He mentions how he has no remorse, but the interviewer asks him, well, if someone did what you did to your daughter and grandkids, he tries to say it's up to the law, but when he won't take that for an answer, he just says, I would be devastated. Then he asks about remorse. He says how he has none. It's not there. It doesn't register. Mentions Watertown again, and that's when he gets up and leaves, tells him to fuck off. So that's 2008's Interview with a Serial Killer, based around the Genesee River killer Arthur Shawcross. Again, it's not very in-depth at all. You can definitely find, an A&E episode, biography episode, any true crime episode, or hell, even any podcasts, serial killers from Parcast or True Crime All the Time have pretty lengthy pieces on Shawcross, or books like this. And this is really just kind of the bullet points, really just the main skeletal, basic story of who Shawcross was. There is a ton more to get into. So this is definitely a good place to start if you're interested in the story. I had heard the name, I didn't know too much about him prior to watching it. So there it can be kind of enlightening, or you can definitely get the gist of his story. So definitely watch this first because it's still interesting. It's still an interesting watch, especially, getting the interview from him. So check this out first and then go look elsewhere into some other things. But yeah, so the collection video of the serial killer books will be coming this weekend. I will be posting that. I'm not sure what documentary or film I'll be doing next, but stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.